Joe, investment. You're
Going to storage.
The enhancement of private Remember? I'm saying because of the how do you
Good morning, distinguished colleagues. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's session of the SDG Investment Fair, which will address the topic On the Road to the SDG Summit, Enhancing Partnerships with the Private Sector. And this session is hosted by DESA's Financing for Sustainable Development Office, and my own office, which is DESA's Division for Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Lotta Tähtinen, and I'm the Chief of Outreach and Partnerships Branch in the Division for SDGs, and it's my great pleasure to be your moderator for this morning's discussion. Dear colleagues, as you all are very well aware, this year, 2023, marks the midpoint of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs. Therefore, urgent and concerted action is needed to make sure that progress towards the SDGs is not compromised in the countries and areas where it is most needed. During yesterday's opening ceremony of the SDG Investment Fair, we heard from many panelists on how to catalyze capital for a sustainable and resilient recovery. We also had presentations on investment opportunities in Colombia and Ethiopia. Today, in this morning's session, we will now discuss the actions that are needed to enhance partnerships with private sector actors and financial institutions to unlock private capital for the SDGs. Scaling up SDG-aligned investments is a key pillar for enhancing impact and SDG ambition, because public resources alone are not sufficient to close the widening gap that currently stands in the trillions of dollars. This is a very important discussion, which will also serve as a stepping stone as we are preparing towards the 2023 SDG Summit to be held this September during the high-level week of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, as it gives us an opportunity to have an overview of the SDG Summit and exploring ways how investment and the financial community can contribute to bridging the financing gaps of the SDGs. So with those short remarks, it is now my great pleasure to to welcome Mr. Navid Hanif, who is Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, to give us an overview of the SDG Summit, its expected outcomes, and opportunities for the private sector to engage. Mr. Hanif, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, moderator, for the introduction and your scene-setting remarks. And good morning to everyone. I will come to the topic of the SDG Summit in a little while. Just want to discuss with you the challenge we are facing on rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals. And if I take away this title, the challenge is how do you fight poverty, hunger, improve gender equality, improve health of people, and save this planet. As all of you know, we are going through very sobering times. Economic growth is decelerating. Geopolitical environment is not very friendly. And the sad thing is we were off track in 2019. We are regressing now. 20 to 25% of the goals, we have gone back. So the challenge is really daunting, but not insurmountable. And that brings me to my next point. A few years ago, I was just in front of a computer and I ran a search. When I typed SDG investment opportunity, less than 10 results came up. When I typed SDG investment gap, there were 400 results. And that's where we were missing the point. Unless we present SDGs as not as a noble cause or moral calling, as a business case, we cannot win the private sector. They also live in this planet, but at a different level. We need to engage with them by showing the opportunity that the SDGs are offering, both in terms of return, but also the way they can contribute to the well-being of humanity and saving this planet. So the SDG Summit that will be held in September, and our distinguished ambassador of Qatar will facilitate the negotiation on the outcome document. There are 4 calls. We are requesting the member states to respond, and all stakeholders also, the private sector, civil society, academia. Each and everyone has to respond. The Secretary General has written a letter to all member states. He's asking for a rescue plan for people and planet. That rescue plan begins with national commitment, national ambition that each leader should bring to the summit. How do you raise your own bar in accelerating action for the SDGs? That's the first call. And we all know, and again, we also understand investment and financing are not the only solutions. It requires capacity to absorb money. It requires good governance. It requires strong institutions. But for this summit, given the challenges we have seen since the pandemic started, the financial challenges are at the top of the list because of the shrinking fiscal space, monetary tightening, bigger outlays for expenditures because of the pandemic and then the war, inflation. So this time, for this summit to succeed, financing and investment will be the central piece. Again, for the circumstances we are going through, and not to mention the growing debt distress in over 52 countries. So that brings me to the second call by the Secretary General, SDG stimulus. 3 components to the stimulus. One is immediate resolution of the debt problems of both middle income and low income countries. And in the long term, fixing the sovereign debt architecture. Second, $500 billion a year, long-term affordable loans by the multilateral development banks by leveraging private investments as well. And third piece is contingency financing. We should not wait for the crisis to happen. We should be prepared with the instruments to give countries and people the resources they need to deal with any shocks. And climate shocks are the headline shocks nowadays. The outcome document will be key for the political message that the leaders want to send. But in addition to that, there will be high impact initiatives, which we are currently designing, but everyone will be invited to join. The initiatives will focus on areas which have multiplier effects. If you address gender inequality in your society, it has a multiplier effect. Girls and women when they enter labor force, you have additional resources coming on board to increase your GDP. Similarly, clear evidence for every year of education for an individual over the period of lifetime, 9% addition in income. Invest in education, repurpose the systems. So high impact initiatives will cover all of these areas. Data for policy making. Once those initiatives are designed and made available, we encourage everyone to participate. And then there is also a call for private sector, in addition to the high impact initiatives, come forward to the summit with special measures to invest in countries which need investment. And that brings me to my last point. So the SDG investment will have many opportunities in addition to the official negotiations for every stakeholder to engage. And my colleague Lota is leading that exercise with the whole system in bringing the local authorities, private sector dealing with micro-industry, microfinance, and also business forum that will be convened to generate. As of now, we are seeking 1,000 commitments in the private sector to advance the SDGs. We have to have high ambition. So this is what will surround the SDG Summit. And it's truly a rescue plan. So I really appeal to you and ask your heads of government and state to come in big numbers and also come with commitments to advance and rescue the SDGs. Let me end my remarks by re-emphasizing the role that the SDG Investment Fair plays. We had great opening yesterday, but I took away two very clear messages. One was from the Minister of Eswatini. He's right here with us, and we are delighted to have him again with us. A very honest, sobering assessment how investment environment is judged and evaluated by the private sector. And that's where SDG 16 is critical. Institutions invest in people because in the end, people are the wealth of nations. Transparency, and then impact measurement with credible, reportable data. That's what investors are looking for. The second message was for the private sector. Please just do not look for higher returns. If you are getting high impact, reconsider your returns. Impact is also a return which the asset owners want. And then the role of the public sector and the MDBs to facilitate investment. The private sector, no matter how noble their intentions are, they have obligations. Let's not forget the money they invest is someone's pension, someone's savings. They have an obligation to make sure that money is not lost. So the conversation today is about partnerships. I wanted to share with you the conversation from yesterday. Partnerships means both partners have to come to the table with a clear understanding of each other's roles and then strike a deal to advance the SDGs, actually to rescue the SDGs which are on life support. So once again, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and I am looking forward to a very engaging and productive discussion on this topic of creating partnerships. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you so much, Mr. Navid, Hanif, for those very sobering and clear remarks, providing a roadmap for the private sector on how to prepare for the SDG Summit. And I think now you have a very clear understanding of the expectations that are on the table. So next, I would like to invite all of us to see a recorded message from Ms. Sanda Ojiambo, who is Assistant Secretary General and the CEO of UN Global Compact, and spearheading the private sector engagement in the SDG Summit.
Excellencies, business leaders, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to greet you today, and I'd like to thank you all for participating. The SDG Investment Fair is a critical destination on the road to the 2023 SDG Summit this September. Your discussions here will build on last month's insightful dialogue on SDG finance at the LDC +5 conference in Doha in Qatar. And truly, the need for this conversation has never been greater. Let me get right to the point. The reality is that we have no hope of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals without private sector investments and the mobilization of financial markets. With more than $17 trillion in annual investments in capital expenditures, research and development, talent and marketing, companies and chief financial officers, or CFOs, are the main players in the sustainability transition of the global economy. Direct investments in markets, technologies, infrastructure, and people are essential for achieving the SDGs. These range from enabling net zero through the circular economy and carbon capture to critical domestic and foreign investment in the least developed countries. Even against the current backdrop of global crises, we believe there's ample capital in the world to provide the $5 to $7 trillion needed to achieve the SDGs. In fact, the market for sustainable financing and investment has been estimated at $31 trillion. However, much of global wealth currently sits in stranded assets or investments that do not advance sustainable development. To address these obstacles, the UN Global Compact CFO Coalition for the SDGs was created to establish a broad coalition of chief financial officers across sectors and industries worldwide. In 2021, the CFOs in this group committed to investing $500 billion by 2025 towards the SDGs, and to have close to 50% of all corporate financing represented by sustainable financing instruments. Today, I'm excited to announce that these CFOs have already made $108 billion pledges in SDG-aligned investments. And despite macroeconomic uncertainties, they are still committed to meeting and hopefully exceeding our 2025 goal. And on the financing side, CFOs reported $135 billion in sustainable financing in 2021, an increase of 55% from $67 billion in 2020. This year marks the halfway point of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a critical milestone for the private sector to revive efforts towards achieving the SDGs. And that is why in the next coming months, we will be calling on all companies to focus their efforts in areas where they can make the greatest impact on sustainable development. Companies will be guided in setting targets and taking action on living wage, climate change, gender equality, water stewardship, and sustainable finance to advance the 2030 Agenda as a whole. CFOs can turn these ambitious commitments into investments, including through capital spending, human capital, research, development, and marketing. In addition, CFOs can increase the credibility of SDG finance by shifting from process-based to outcome-based impact measurement and from project-based to corporate-wide accountability. Dear friends, I invite all companies here to take action on these key sustainability issues and to join the CFO Coalition for the SDGs. And I invite government and civil society actors to join us in enabling and growing our corporate sustainability movement. Because it is only through these types of collaborations that we will achieve a more just and sustainable world. Thank you, and I know today's event will be filled with fruitful discussions towards this goal.
Thank you for those remarks. And we will now move to hearing from our distinguished panelists who are with us this morning. Let me first introduce, we have Ms. Alaya bint Ahmed Al-Thani, who is the permanent representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations, and also has the very important role of co-facilitating the political negotiations on the outcome declaration of the SDG Summit. We also have Mr. Arsalan Mahtafar, who is Executive Director of Development Impact, JP Morgan. And to my right, we have Ms. Tahmina Haq, Executive Director, the Standard Chartered Bank. And to my far right, Ms. Mariangela Paralancourt, who is the Chief of Strategic Engagement and Policy Integration in the Financing for Sustainable Development Office of UN DESA. To kick off this panel discussion, I would like to ask Her Excellency, Ms. Alaya bint Ahmed Al-Thani, to provide her framing remarks on how to scale up private finance and investment, both in her capacity as permanent representative, but also as a co-facilitator for the negotiations. After we have heard from the ambassador, I will then pose some questions for the remaining panelists to respond before I open the floor for questions and reflections from the audience. So, Ms. Al-Thani, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lotta. At the outset, of course, I would like to thank the President of ICSOC for the invitation to participate in this timely and crucial panel discussion on the important theme of enhancing partnerships with the private sector during this important occasion of the SDG Investment Fair. The State of Qatar, of course, believes in the central role of the private sector to achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The private sector is a significant driver of innovation, economic growth, job creation, and the advancement of digital technologies, which are essential components for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. This was very well exemplified during the most recent UN conference, the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries, that was held in Doha from March 5th to the 9th of this year. As ASG Sanja have mentioned, the private sector forum, co-chaired by the chairman of the State of Qatar's Chamber of Commerce and the president of Microsoft, convened over 300 business sector representatives to encourage a more effective role of the private sector in the implementation of the Doha Programme of Action for the Least Developed Countries. It was very successful, with commitments ranging from financial investment, economic growth, job creation, and innovative solutions to support the LDCs. It demonstrated that governments, multilateral institutions, and the private sector, working through enhanced public-private partnerships, provide the best chance for a scalable projects to be developed, and that blended finance is crucial. The State of Qatar, of course, also has partnered with the private sector in the delivery of Qatar National Vision 2030, our blueprint for socio-economic development. An example is that Qatar Investment Authority, of course, our sovereign fund, which has demonstrated its commitment to the SDGs through a number of initiatives. Qatar Investment Authority has established a dedicated team to focus on sustainable investment and has signed up to the UN Principle for Responsible Investment. And this is just an example of how important the entities, the sovereign funds entities, and the private sector in general can play an important role in financing innovative approaches when it comes to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Most importantly, QIA has established the Qatar Investment Fund for Climate Change to invest in projects and companies that align with the climate agenda and the SDGs, including renewable energy projects, energy-efficient buildings, and sustainable transportation, not only in Qatar, but globally. The fund has also partnered with UNFCCC and the Global Green Growth Institute to support the implementation of climate-friendly initiatives and promote sustainable development. It has also financed education and access to healthcare in developing countries. We have established the Qatar Development Bank to promote innovation as well by identifying investment opportunities and partnerships that scale up SDG-aligned investments. The Green Business Fund, one of the bank's initiatives to support the SDGs, provide financing to small and medium-sized enterprises that are developing environmentally sustainable business projects, thereby contributing to SDG 7, SDG 8, and of course SDG 13. Within the framework of encouraging investment in developing countries, Qatar has signed more than 50 bilateral agreements to encourage investments in this regard. Qatar also focused on strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development by providing financial resources to developing countries through remittances for foreign workers, which amounts to 7.92% of the GDP of the state of Qatar in 2018. In light of the significant result-oriented partnerships, I would like also to highlight that Qatar contribution of $50 million to the Lives and Livelihoods Fund, which was established by Qatar Fund for Development, our developmental arm, and the Islamic Development Bank. These funds, of course, help people to be out of poverty in the Islamic countries region. Qatar Fund for Development as well established partnerships with private sector companies to support sustainable development initiatives in developing countries, and has also provided financial support to private sector companies that are investing in sustainable development initiatives in developing countries. Of course, on how to scale up essential investments in the SDGs, and of course, this is a very great opportunity to shed light on enhancing partnerships with the private sector and how can we build upon this example. Of course, I have, as the moderator have mentioned, I'm very privileged, of course, to co-facilitate the negotiations for the political declarations for the SDG Summit, together with the Permanent Representative of Ireland, Ambassador Virgil. Again, as Mr. Navid have mentioned, the SDG Summit in September will mark the midpoint in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, crucial to rescue the SDGs, to put them back on track, and will provide a key platform, again, for engaging the private sector as an important stakeholder in achieving the SDGs. Again, the SDG Summit is the opportunity to mobilize for a greater involvement, engagement, by and with the private sector, for us to be able to meet the goals, the global goals, our ambitious and action-oriented outcome. Again, I cannot emphasize more how important that we need to use this milestone opportunity in September for a greater engagement for the private sector. We don't need them to be there as listeners. We need to see them there as partners. We have an ambitious agenda, at least on the innovation and technology front. We cannot go about it without the expertise, not only the financial resources, but the expertise as well of the private sector, the high-tech companies. I think these are very important moments where we really need to, again, yes, it is a member state-driven process, but again, it's an opportunity to engage, realistically, the key stakeholders, and as we discussed today, the involvement of the private sector. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And we do hope that this morning's discussions will indeed be a first opportunity for you as co-facilitator to also hear firsthand some concrete recommendations from private sector actors on how can we scale up investment, and importantly, what is it that the private sector would need from governments in this regard. So, let me now pose a few questions to our three panelists who are with us here today. Colleagues, I am mindful of time. We are supposed to wrap this session up by 9:45, so I would plead to all of you to please be concise. so that we will have a chance to also have some questions from our audience. So my very first questions to you panelists is the following. What are the key challenges to further unlocking capital markets to bridge the financing gap for sustainable development? And what do you think are the key enablers that policymakers can provide in this regard? So first, let's hear from Ms. Tahmina Haq, who is Executive Director, Standard Chartered Bank, to hear your thoughts and views.
Thank you very much. I think we all understand that finance is not flowing to the SDGs at the level required to meet the gap, which is estimated to be 2.5 trillion every year in the emerging markets. And in order to meet that gap, I think reforms are required at all levels: governments, MDB and DFI community, regulators, as well as the private sector. I'll bring in the private sector point of view and highlight some of the key challenges that we face. Post-global financial crisis, lending to long-term projects in emerging markets, say in sustainable infrastructure, has become extremely expensive in terms of capital and liquidity requirements. In addition to that, we are seeing a lack of government's focus on making private sector mobilization a key objective of their financing. And to add to that, there is an insufficient pipeline of bankable projects, especially in markets where it's most needed. As Mr. Hanif mentioned during the introduction, we are in a very challenging situation now. Debt levels are elevated, especially in emerging markets. There's very limited fiscal space. And this is something that has been addressed by the SDG stimulus as well. To add to that, we are expecting a slowdown in the developed markets, which will trigger a risk-off sentiment, which will again affect the emerging market sovereigns as well. In this challenging time, what we are seeing is public and private partnerships can become an essential policy tool. So within public-private partnerships, I think specific focus should be given to blended finance. We have seen that blended finance has brought in excellent advantages in the past. And blended finance has the potential to bring in private sector expertise as well as MDBs while ensuring that there's value for money and affordability for the governments. So I think blended finance should become a key enabler if we want to meet the SDG gap.
Thank you so much for those very clear points and recommendations. And really a big takeaway is the need of blended finance and public-private partnerships as an essential tool. So now let me turn the floor over to Mr. Arsalan Mahtafar, who's Executive Director of Development Impact at JP Morgan. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. As Tamina mentioned, there is trillions of dollars needed to finance the SDGs in emerging markets. The good news is that there are currently $35 trillion of private capital managed by institutional investors that incorporates some measure of environmental and social and governance criteria in their capital allocation. So ESG is an established asset class, and it's expected to grow to $50 trillion by 2025. The complication is that one of the conduits to access this capital, especially in debt capital markets, is through the issuance of ESG-labeled bonds. However, the majority of ESG-labeled bonds are being issued by developed market issuers. And some say the solution is to provide more technical assistance to EM issuers to issue more EM-labeled bonds. But I think there's a bit of a limit to how far that could go. ESG-labeled bonds are mostly use of proceed bonds, and that requires the issuer to already have a pipeline of CapEx projects fully costed out that would be of benchmark size. And a lot of emerging market entities, it might be a public transportation company or a water utility or even a small country government, do not have CapEx projects that aggregate to that size for that instrument to be usable for them. And so that's a bit of the tragedy here, that a lot of entities that could have a lot of impact on poverty alleviation, on advancing the SDGs, are cut off from this ESG capital. So our solution is to establish frameworks that help measure and provide transparency and reporting at the issuer level rather than at the issuance level. Now, this might sound like a technicality, but the difference is, rather than trying to scale up the $200 billion EM ESG bond market, let's give investors the tools to sift through the $29 trillion of conventional EM bonds and identify the instruments that have contributions to the SDGs and be able to direct their ESG capital to that. And so our request from policymakers is, for instance, the bodies that regulate sustainable finance, like EuroSIF, that have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, to recognize investments in conventional bonds issued by issuers that provide some standard of transparency and reporting on their SDG impact as a sustainable investment, so that funds have comfort in investing in such instruments. And we estimate that could almost immediately increase the flow of ESG capital to the SDGs by 2x over the next years.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very concrete suggestion. And I think this is perhaps an opportunity later on to also hear from our audience some of your views on this particular issue. So now let me move to our second question to our panelists. As we heard earlier from our Assistant Secretary General, Navid Hanif, the Secretary General of the UN has issued the SDG stimulus to deliver the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And this stimulus is seeking to offset unfavorable market conditions that developing countries are facing through investments. And this package has put forward 3 areas for immediate action. Firstly, tackle the high cost of debt and rising risks of debt distress. Secondly, massively scaling up affordable long-term financing for development. And thirdly, expanding contingency financing to countries in need. So with this backdrop, my second question to the panelists is, how do you see the private sector could contribute to this SDG stimulus call for investing in SDGs? So let me give the floor first to Ms. Mariangela Paralancourt, who's the Chief of Strategic Engagement and Policy Integration in the DESA's Financing for Development, Sustainable Development Office. Mariangela?
Thank you so much, Lotta, and thank you everybody for being here. The private sector has a very important role to play, and in the SDG stimulus, it is clear that, for example, the role of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks and public development banks, can be really catalyze a private investment. Private blended finance, as was mentioned here, is really important, and we are seeing it growing. And through growing, you learn, you get lessons from that. And so blended finance has been positive in many ways, but we have also learned things that have not been perfect. So we need to keep working on blended finance and make it better for all players. In the SDG stimulus, for example, it is clear that some of the de-risking elements and some of the guarantees may not benefit or distribute the risks in a fair way for developing countries. So in this sense, I go back to what the ASG Navid Hanif said. We should also be looking for high impact. We should also be looking for what we want to address, obviously, the obligations for the investors, but we also want to build a more sustainable financial system for all. And this is very important. We need to build trust with every transaction. We need to build trust between governments and private sector so that we can all together achieve the SDGs. So that's one point. The other one is in the way to the SDG Summit, the Global Investor for Sustainable Alliance, which is an alliance for the Secretary General to really provide policy views and really concrete suggestions, including metrics, for example, to avoid greenwashing, including other policy recommendations, for example, on how can we strengthen the mobilization of private capital through the MDBs, which was recently discussed by the B20 and the Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing that we're discussing at the World Bank and IMF spring meetings. These coming here together, the fact that we have together Standard Charter here, and we are all together showing this will to create initiatives and to work together, I think that's another important, very important way to do it.
Thank you very much, Mariangela. Let me now go back to Arsalan Mahtafa. Let's hear from you.
So one of the areas I think the private sector could take a bit of a leadership role is in the area, the first action area you mentioned around assisting highly indebted countries with debt sustainability and reducing the cost of debt. So one of the products that were mentioned in the SDG stimulus were debt for SDG swaps. We know that a few of these type of products have been executed, but the uptake has been limited in part, as mentioned in the SDG stimulus, due to high transaction costs. And let me share, from our perspective as an investment bank that often structure and execute these type of swaps, when you have a product that is highly bespoke, that's going to require a lot of coordination across teams and a lot of back and forth across different parties, and that increases the amount of time and resources required to execute such a product, and therefore, banks will only pursue the transactions that have the highest fees and would be worth that investment of time and resources. So how can you really scale this product? I think the answer kind of goes back to standardization. One of the key components of these structures is a public development bank to come and provide a guarantee on a special purpose vehicle that would issue new debt and then purchase the distressed debt at a discount and refinance it for longer maturities, and so that then the savings from the debt servicing costs can be reinvested in SDG investments. But the terms and conditions that public development banks would need in order to guarantee these SPV structures, they're not clear and they're not communicated. And therefore, us banks have to kind of run across the alphabet soup of development banks and the private investors and the developing countries to find a structure that will work for all. And again, it just increases the cost and reduces the replicability. So I think the private sector can take a leading role to define the terms and conditions that would be workable for the market, but it does really also require the collaboration of the public development banks to also clarify what works for them to provide the guarantee that is needed in that structure so that this could be replicated at scale.
Thank you very much again for those very concrete recommendations. Let's now hear from Tahmina Haq.
Thank you. I think Arsalan has raised some very good points. I'm just going to step back a little and reinforce the fact that the private sector has the SDGs attention. And we are seeing certain sections of the private sector making it an intrinsic part of their operations. For instance, as Standard Chartered, sustainability is a core part of our strategy. It's hardwired into our DNA. As you may know, we have committed to provide $75 billion to SDGs by next year, and we have $300 billion of commitment for green and transition financing in emerging markets by 2030. We are also seeing an emergence of very important alliances, such as the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, GISD Alliance, GFANS, who are putting their weight behind these causes, and the private sector is an integral part of those alliances. I've already highlighted the constraints and the requirements that we face, but I'm happy to share a couple of initiatives that we are looking at to solve this issue. One of the initiatives have already been highlighted by Arsalan, which are the debt for nature swaps that was done recently in Belize, we're looking to broadening it up to cover all SDGs. In addition to that, we're increasingly looking at, as I mentioned earlier, blended finance, where we bring in de-risking instruments from the MDBs to scale up the private sector investment. We are looking at unique structures such as securitizations to bring in institutional investors, because investors across all product classes, be it loans, bonds, or equity, are increasingly looking at green, looking into the green space. So, and this trend will continue to accelerate. We're also looking at some structures where we can help the MDBs free up their balance sheet, but it comes with its own complications, and we would need a bigger forum to discuss that. But one thing I need to mention is private sector mobilization cannot be done by private sector alone. We would need help and support from all stakeholders, especially the local governments. So to start with, local governments would need to support us by bringing in the credible or bankable projects and the policy reforms required to scale up private sector investment. So it was very encouraging to hear from Ms. Alia what is being done in Qatar. So once I think we can establish and work together, I think only then we can see the results that are being expected from the private sector.
Thank you very much. And that leads us very well to my last, third question to our panelists. You have all alluded to this issue already in your interventions, but what more can the financial sector and the investment community do in the lead up to the SDG Summit, but of course also beyond, to scale up SDG-aligned investments, including collaborating with key actors such as governments, local governments, investors, development banks, and civil society? So Arsalan, the floor is yours first.
Thank you. One thing that, and here I'm going to maybe step back and just kind of think about it more in terms of the nature of collaboration between these various partners. And one thing that I think that is sometimes a barrier to collaboration is ideological. Some, and not all, but some members of civil society or the public sector often view the private sector as, you know, these greedy entities that are trying to just only make profits for their shareholders. And there's an element of mistrust that sometimes inhibits collaboration. And, you know, the reality is that, you know, true, there's some private sector entities that might be, you know, making profits from monopolies or other rent-seeking behavior. But, you know, most private sector entities make profits from supplying products and services that people need. And I don't know if it's shifting demographics or other reasons of global elevated social consciousness, but there is now an emerging need for people to invest their savings in places that have positive impact in the world. And the private sector could play a key role of channeling savings to investments that produce positive impact. And they can be compensated for that service that they're providing. And so there's no contradiction between the two. And so I think that if you kind of combine the impact and which the values of which is often defined by the public sector and the nonprofit sector with the dynamics of supply and demand of the market, you could really scale up collaboration in these type of fora, in other industry working groups and task forces at the level that is really needed to meet this daunting SDG challenge.
Arsalan, thank you very much. Tahmina, let's hear from you.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, all stakeholders must put their weight behind the SDGs if we stand a chance to achieve them. We need the governments, we need the MDB and the DFI community to blend the risk or de-risk the investment so we can significantly scale up private sector involvement as well. And if we can make it happen, the results will be transformating. And I'm going to share an example of that. In 2021, Standard Chartered led $1 billion of financing for the Ministry of Finance Angola. The proceeds of this financing was for a very critical SDG. It gave access to clean water to 2 million people in Luanda. So World Bank came in with a partial credit guarantee, which helped in securing a second loss cover from Africa Trade Insurance. So at a time when there was a high aversion, high level of risk aversion coming out of the pandemic, in a region like Africa, this structure provided significant risk mitigation and helped in significantly scaling up private sector investment in a very critical SDG. So you can see that this power of collaboration is what is required if we want to meet the SDG gap. Now, how do we enhance this collaboration? And one thing that is a very powerful point raised by Arsalan is the ideological barrier we have. That's one thing we need to solve. We need to speak the same language if we want to solve this issue. There are other areas where we need to collectively solve the problems. For instance, standardization is one area, be it in project contracts or sustainability disclosures. I think it's important to have that standardization across public and private sector. In addition to that, there are data gaps, especially for emerging markets, which tend to add to the risk premia and cost of capital in these countries. So that's another area we need to collectively look at. One thing I would like to end my point with is private sector is a significant part of this process and a significant part of the solution. But if we want to make these solutions long-term and sustainable, we would need to join hands and collaborate in a way that works for all of us. So we can't necessarily, I think, make one party responsible for this. We all need to be responsible if we want to meet the SDG gap.
Thank you so much, Tahmina. Now to wrap up, I'll give the floor to Mariangela, and then I'm hoping we will have a few minutes to hear questions from our audience.
Thank you so much. I really like the way that the conversation is going, because the SDG Investment Fair is precisely the space in which we are building this partnership all together. We identified a gap between the private sector, considering rightly that there is not a pipeline of bankable projects that can be really kind of broad because of all the risks perceived and not and real. And we also have the side of the governments that come to us, come here and say, listen, we have these projects. We are behind these projects. Every project that comes to the fair has been vetted by the governments. It's supported, has been brought to the highest technical level that they can bring. And with our support, we kind of make them better. We kind of make the pitches, because the conversation is also about the differences between the language that we speak. And it's not only about ideology, it's very practical. I mean, if you are in a developing country, you may not know that you need this specific number, this specific metric. How can you sell the project? What do you need to show about the country, about the region, about the solidity of the financial results, of the legal system? And so this is the effort that the SDG Investment Fair is doing. And we have been building upon to become like this platform. This is not a DESA exercise. This is a UN exercise, UN ecosystem on SDG investment. But we also have obviously the private sector. We have been working this is the 8th fair. We have been working, building this trust and these relationships to learn more from you. We want to know, how do we make these $6 billion billion-dollar projects that we have today, for example, one of them or two of them have that amount of money? How can we take that? Because that's interesting for big players. We also have other projects that are a few millions that are interested for other kind of investors, and that have maybe more about impact investment in the sense of helping an indigenous community, for example. That's important. We have had the multilateral development banks talking to us here. We have had the public development banks, this huge alliance of banks that can really help this process of blended finance, that brings everybody together from communities, governments, and the private sector to really work for the SDGs together. And we are also trying to fix the data gap. We have created a database that, in a sense, I'll wrap up in a second, yes, that in a sense will give access to the governments of what are the technical facilities that are available in those banks to help them bring those projects up. So to wrap up, thank you for being here. Let's keep working together to change the conversation and create this movement that we need to really achieve the SDGs, not blaming, not anything, but kind of working together with pride. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariangela. Now we have a few minutes left for questions, comments from the floor. If you could please press the button on your console to indicate your interest to intervene. And I would like to first recognize Minister from Eswatini. The floor is yours, Excellency.
Thank you very much. So first of all, just to appreciate the panel, appreciate the comments made, very interesting, and I think one can definitely learn a lot from it. But secondly, also just to appreciate the UN in our countries. We obviously have strong UN presence. We have a large UN office. But lately, the UN has also started to get more involved in actually trying to assist on the economic fronts. In Eswatini, the UNDP specifically is come up with a very strong program, bringing funding together for that, that is encouraging entrepreneurship and really getting their hands dirty, really grassroots stuff where they are placing students in different companies, just playing that coordination role of developing entrepreneurship at Eswatini, and very, very impactful, and just want to make sure that we appreciate that, and maybe just at this level to recognize that. But secondly, what one does realize, and again, obviously, as a Minister of Finance, I'm also a governor at the IMF, and so understanding that the intentions from the multilaterals are fantastic. For instance, when an SDR allocation is issued, it really is for the 100% the right reasons and for the right things. But to kind of ask the UN, again, to look at it from, and I'm getting to the private sector now, but to ask the UN, since they do play a world referee kind of role, not that they want to, not that they're comfortable doing that, but you kind of end up there, as well as the fact that, and I'd like to use the word if, but unfortunately the right word is when. When things go wrong in countries, the monkey jumps onto the UN's back. And for that reason, just to appeal to the UN to say if one can have the economics divisions, which we know one does really look at these things from a macro point of view, to have a look at how impactful, and I'll use SDRs as an example because the intention is fantastic, but the SDRs get rolled out, SDRs creating a whole lot of extra cash in especially the countries that draw the money down from the SDR allocation. It drives inflation. Inflation rises. In developing countries, the inflation is absolutely brutal compared to the rest of the world. The rest of the world, we're all suffering from inflation, but in developing countries, it has got a multiplier effect. The multiplier effect means that the currencies just go on an absolute slide, and the battles keep up. And at the end of the day, somehow, when the dust settles after a period of time, they find themselves so much worse off, after getting the assistance with a fantastic intent behind it through. So to again appeal to the UN to say, is there something which one can do to re-look at how this is happening? And again, SDR allocations, there's discussions around that and how that works, which again is, but the discussions that we're having here around blended finance is to say, and when I say blended finance, I mean blended finance with a first loss, from multilaterals. Let me just be straight with what one means here. To be able to draw in the private sector. Because again, as a Minister of Finance in Eswatini, we currently have not taken commercial funding or external commercial funding. We have a lot offered to us, but because of the cost, I've just never gone down that road. At the moment, fortunately, grace involved maybe, we've managed to remain only with concessional funding on our external debt, which is about 20% of our debt to GDP ratio. But But many countries go down the road. You become desperate, and you end up taking the commercial funding and the cost, and you just, like I say, you end up on a slippery slope, and there's no way back out the slippery slope unless there's a very, very, harsh, tough and tense. So if one can look at a blended finance point of view, look at, as was touched on, what we are looking at this fair, the kind of projects that are being approved, and the money coming into the private sector from a blended finance point of view, that's going to be the catalyzer to really get the growth that we need in the countries to ultimately deal with the SDGs. The countries need to take responsibility for the SDGs. But we can only do that, if the economies grow and one actually does get the amount of money. So I do believe one can try and assist and ask the UN to assist on that front, to look at us holistically and assist us all around the table to ultimately do the right thing, is really the main appeal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Colleagues, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I see 3 other indications of interest to speak, but regrettably, we won't have time to hear from you. I would invite you to perhaps approach the panelists afterwards to raise your questions or comments. Big thank you to everyone, our panelists, the audience, for being here today. I'm really looking forward to the summary of this discussion and also finding a way to really feed it to the co-facilitators of the political declaration, since there are some very concrete recommendations to policymakers on how to improve financing of the SDGs and improve the actions that the private sector can take in this regard. So with no more speakers, I would like to thank everyone, adjourn this meeting. There will be another meeting starting in this room at 10 a.m. So I would like to invite those of you who will not remain in the room for that meeting to please take your conversations in the hallways. Thank you, and have a lovely rest of the day.